Hello, everybody. I'm Indu Chandrasekhar, Managing Editor of Tulika Books. It is a pleasure and a privilege to welcome you all on behalf of the Safdar Hashmi Memorial Trust, SEMAT, the journal Social Scientist, and Tulika Books to this symposium in defense of history on the occasion of eminent historian Professor Irfan Habib's 90th birthday. Greetings and best wishes to you, Irfan Saab, on your birthday. For those of you who may not know, a word about Professor Habib's association with the organizers of today's event. He is currently the chairperson of SEMAT and has been actively involved in all its campaigns, especially in defense of secularism and against communal attacks on the writing and teaching of history. He is an advisory editor of and a consistent contributor to Social Scientist, and most of his analyses and critiques, both academic and on issues of contemporary relevance, have been published in the pages of the journal. Tulika Books dates the beginning of its publishing program to Professor Habib's collection of seminal essays, Essays in Indian History, Towards a Marxist Perception, published in 1995, and which continues to be in print today. Besides, of course, the numerous other books he has authored or edited for us since then. Now for a few housekeeping points. We will be turning off the audio and video of all the attendees except for the speakers. This session is being recorded, and the recording will be shared on various platforms, including the SEMAT and Tulika websites. Also, the texts of the presentations will be published in Social Scientist. For reasons of time management, it will not be possible to accommodate questions or comments from the audience at the end of the session. We apologize, we regret that. With this, I hand over to Professor Prabhat Patnaik, who will chair the discussion and introduce the speakers, the eminent participants in the symposium. But before that, a few words to introduce Professor Patnaik himself. Prabhat Patnaik is Professor Emeritus of Economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Through his work as an academic, as editor of Social Scientist, as a columnist in People's Democracy, and as a leading theoretician of the left, he has contributed immensely to developing a theoretical understanding of India's economy and society, and the tactics and strategy needed to change it in socialist direction. He is the author of Accumulation and Stability Under Capitalism, The Value of Money, and Re-Envisioning Socialism, among other books. A Theory of Imperialism and Capital and Imperialism are his most recent books, both co-authored with Utsa Patnaik. Over to you now, Prabhat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Indu. It's a matter of great privilege for me that I have been allowed to be a part of this event to celebrate the 90th birthday of Professor Irfan Habib, who has had such major influence on the lives of all of us, including myself. Now, without wasting any more time, I would like to begin with the felicitations that two of the speakers would be giving for Professor Irfan Habib. And the first of them is Comrade Sitaram Yechuri, General Secretary of the Communist Party of India, Marxist. By a curious coincidence, it also happens to be Comrade Yechuri's birthday today. So I'd like to congratulate him as well as Professor Habib on their birthday and invite Sitaram to make his presentation.
Thank you, Prabhat. Everybody, the most eminent set of people that I've known are all here present today. Romila, Professor Bakshi, Prabhat himself, of course, Irfan Saab, Aditya Mukherjee, and many others. So here, many who have taught me. So I'm a little intimidated actually to speak in this in this gathering. But as Prabhat said, I have the honor of sharing my birthday with Comrade Irfan Habib. And ever since I learned of this, I worn it as a badge of honor, thinking that some of that, that competence, that reputation of Professor Irfan Habib would be reflected on me as well, because I happen to have been born on the same day. But that apart, I keep calling Comrade Irfan as Comrade Irfan because he always calls me as Comrade. And he's been a comrade of the Communist Party since before I was born. I mean, his entire history of the way he was associated with the party and going through the most tumultuous periods in the history of the world, history of our partition, and history particularly of India during that period. In the 1940s and the 50s, and during the partition, during the communal riots, I joined the party almost when I was born. And since then, from then till today, I have not seen or heard Comrade Irfan Habib ever look back, reflecting on whether he's done the right thing or the wrong thing. His commitment, dedication to the cause of communism, Marxism, and to the upliftment of the Indian people and for social change has been and remains a superb example of what human commitment is all about. I mean, of course, his contributions in the academic field will be dealt with, where his contemporaries, colleagues, and more competent historians. But what we'll be discussing today, I think politically is the most important issue among many others, but I would give a preference to this entire thing on the question of history and how that is being manipulated, which has always been by fascistic authoritarian regimes, distorting history, rewriting history, attacking reason, promoting unreason, attacking rationality, promoting irrationality, and finding a historical justification for that. That has been the history of such right-wing fascistic movements, and that is exactly what we are witnessing today. But this would be an important contribution, I think an excellent way to celebrate the Irfan Saab's 90th birthday and to wish him many, many more years of such contributions. In particular, I would like to mention, which is relevant today, and I wish the organizers of this felicitation and celebration to Comrade Irfan Habib will republish some of those things that Comrade Irfan had produced, the entire history of the Babri Masjid, for instance. Next year, you're going to have, in a grandiose way, the inauguration of the Ram Temple in Ayodhya. And this history of the Babri Masjid will also be virtually erased. I think it's time to actually refresh the memory. And Irfan Saab's pamphlet, which I remember Samet publishing it at that time, that is something I think we should need to republish. And also this entire campaign against saffronization of education under Vajpayee government with this new economic policy. And we heard the Prime Minister talk all sorts of things just a couple of days ago on the new education policy that his government is promoting. So I think part of this celebrations of the 90th birthday, I think we should bring these back into public focus. And that, I think, it will be important. And I hope Samat and Tulika and everybody will undertake this job. Well, I really do not wish to say, except for one fact, that he has been a source of inspiration to my generation and continues to be because of the strength of their commitment. I mean, this is something. I'm sorry, is that a time signal?
No.
Now, you please warn me if I'm speaking too long, but now that I was saying that he continues to remain a source of inspiration for his determination and commitment to the party, his loyalty, and there have been various occasions when you recollect the party used to contest the elections and left candidates. We used to have Tridip Chaudhary earlier. After some gap, Captain Lakshmi Saigal was fielded by the by the left as the presidential candidate. There were times when we were looking for a vice presidential candidate. On one occasion, I was asked by the then General Secretary, Comrade Surjit, to talk to Comrade Irfan to see whether he'd be willing. I mean, before talking to him, I told Comrade Surjit that I don't think he will agree. It's out of the question. But he said, no, you talk to him. So I spoke to Comrade Irfan. I mean, he was very reluctant. But then, and this is the quality of his commitment to the party. He said, I'll do whatever the party will decide. So, I mean, this is a quality which, I mean, is something that is very, very, important for many of us to internalize in my generation, which we're all trying to do. Another factor is that it's not only his economic excellence and contributions, his commitment to the cause of human liberation and emancipation and upliftment, his work at the ground level in the employees union of the lowest categories of employees in Aligarh, and he would take many of us, including me, to their conferences. Being an eminent professor of international repute, he would still be doing that work, which I think he still continues. And commitment with the Aligarh historians group and the mega project of People's History of India. I mean, all that apart, he also would provoke us into thinking about many issues, which at that point of time, many thought was not being loyal to the party. I remember a time when we were all buzzing out of the students and the student activists. Only the last, as an example, I want to give him that how he would provoke us into thinking. And within the framework of the party, when many thought that he was breaking the threshold of party discipline or party thinking, that was the time when the Soviet Union declared that the Soviet Union is no longer the dictatorship of the proletariat, but people of the whole state. So now that in the Marxist circles was a big issue for discussion and uproar. Is it that under socialism, it's not the dictatorship of the proletariat, but is it that everybody has become the proletariat? What is the meaning of the people of the whole state? How are the others part of the state? I mean, the issue was the question of relationship between the individual, the state, and democracy within socialism. How is that whole area to be settled after so many decades of socialism? These were extremely new thoughts, and in fact, anticipated in a sense many of the things that happened, which we, in retrospect, we meaning the party, in retrospect, analyzed it as when the Soviet Union collapsed. In the party's resolution on certain ideological issues, this whole gamut of socialist democracy, the relationship between the individual and the state, and how it was working, this entire area was explored, and we came, after a very intense discussion, to certain conclusions. And that the people of the whole state and the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat, going back to what Lenin said, analyzed in The State and the Revolution, where he says, in a capitalist country, the form of governance can be very varied, from a monarchy to a presidential form to a parliamentary democracy to various other forms. But the essence remains the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. In a socialist country, these forms can be more varied, but the essence will always remain the dictatorship of the proletariat. So the class character of the state was something that had to be asserted not by asserting the dictatorship part of the proletariat, but on the question of the control of the state by the ruling classes, which is the proletariat under socialism. By not doing that or doing that wrongly, what were the distortions that followed? In our limited capacity, the party as a whole, we defined all those things and came to a conclusion, like Lenin would say, as democracy deepens under socialism, every cook will be able to govern. And these entire gamut of discussions within the organized communist movement were triggered off by certain comments on the question of the relationship between the individual and the state and democracy under socialism. And I think Comrade Irfan Habib had made many of us, my generation in the party, actually think about these issues, and which is absolutely essential. And that is where the creativity of Marxism comes in. And I think I must, in retrospect, profusely thank him for what many thought was something wrong that he was doing then in the 80s, actually triggered off such a debate, which eventually led to I would say a better understanding, if not given greater clarity. But on his 90th birthday, I can only say, please continue to provoke us, Comrade Irfan Habib. Please continue to keep writing and provoking us to think on all these issues, because there are many, many more years for you to contribute and many more years for us to learn. And I'm sure in the coming days, with his unwavering, unstinted commitment to not merely the party, but to human liberation and to fighting the present challenges of today's time in defense of history, his contributions would be immense. So let me once again join everybody here in wishing you a very, very happy birthday and many, many happy returns of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sitaram. Thank you for those comments. The next speaker, I should go straight on to the next speaker, is Professor Shireen Musri, who has been a colleague of Irfan Saab for decades, who is an outstanding historian herself, and she's now retired as a professor of history in Aligarh Muslim University. She would be giving her words of appreciation for Professor Irfan Habib, and I invite Shireen Musri. Shireen?
Shireen, can you hear us?
Video is off. I've unmuted her.
Shireen, can you hear us?
Then Indu, maybe I should...
I think we should carry on and we'll get...
That's right. Maybe at the end we shall get Shireen to speak.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. So then I would call upon the next speaker, Professor Romila Thapar, who is a legend among the historians and generally in India's intellectual life. I must say, when I was an undergraduate student in Delhi University, even though history was not my subject, Professor Thapar had just joined the Delhi University, and we would sneak into her lectures just to take a look at her. So she had that kind of charisma then, and she still has that now. She's an outstanding historian, Kluge Prize awardee, and what is more, she is perhaps the foremost public intellectual in the country. Professor Emerita in Jawaharlal Nehru University. I'd like to invite Professor Romila Thapar to speak.
Thank you, Prabhat. I would like to begin by thanking all the different organizations that have put this evening together and who invited me to speak. I'm very touched because I'm not speaking here in any official capacity or any representative of any organization or whatever it may be. I'm speaking as a historian, and my intention in this little talk that I will be giving is to pay tribute to a historian whom I greatly admire, Professor Irfan Habib. So thank you very much again for giving me this opportunity to pay my respects. I should begin by conveying birthday greetings to Professor Irfan Habib. All good wishes, Irfan. You have, in your wisdom, provided us with excellent historical vision and insight, and you have received, justifiably, the extensive admiration and affection of friends and family. I wish you yet more of this in the years to come. There is in all of us an anxiety about the times in which we live. Your choice of such an appropriate subject for this evening, the defense of history, is an indication of your concern, as it is of many of us. A spark of hope, however, lies in the conviction that no matter how fierce the attempt to annul the history we study and write, ultimately, the explanation of the past will have to come from rational and logical argument, drawing from reliable sources of information. But the ultimate may be distanced in time. Let us see. Answers to what happened in the past are never single and uniform. Their very complexity and diversity demands further exploration. One has to recognize, however, one theme always undergoes changing explanations. I would like to speak about what used to be called the Aryan question, a subject that we all learnt about in college, wrote tutorials and essays about and so on, became quite bored with the subject, in fact, and now it has come alive again in contemporary politics. And this is why I think it is necessary for us to understand some of the little context in which this problem has come up. It has become highly controversial, and today it seems to go in two directions quite different from each other. Popular opinion is obsessed with the origins of the Aryans. Professional historians are focusing on relatively new sources and the fresh dimension that these sources suggest in order to comprehend the history of the period. In the 19th century, when the Vedic texts came to be studied by European Sanskritists, it was discovered that Vedic Sanskrit had close affinities with other Indo-European languages. These languages had spread from Central Asia westwards via northern Iran to Europe. And the speakers of Vedic Sanskrit, the earliest form of Indo-Aryan, were thought to be genetically related to the speakers of early Indo-European. What was then called race science emerged in the late 19th century. Language and race were equated, and there were theories about the superior Aryan race. It was often forgotten, as it still is, that the term Aryan identifies language and not race. Any number of racially diverse cultures can pick up the same language in a given historical situation, and this has happened repeatedly through history. Historians held that in the early second millennium BC, some groups of agro-pastoralists from Central Asia migrated, probably in search of pastures. Perhaps there was an ecological crisis. A few went to northeastern Iran and a few to nearby northwestern India and the Punjab. A sequence of migrations is listed in the Iranian Avesta, and one wonders whether it is a reference to the same. The Iranian Aryans had close language affinities with the Indo-Aryan speakers. The texts of the two groups have some striking similarities and some equally striking inversions. Colonial scholarship attributed the origins of Hindu culture and religion to this earliest stratum of Vedic Aryanism. Max Muller argued to this effect in the 19th century, and further agreement came from the theosophists, such as Colonel Olcott, who stated that the Aryans originated in India and that they were the ancestors of the Hindus, and that the Hindu religion comes from the Vedas. Aryan culture was center stage in this theory, as it was in some of the organizations of the time, such as the Arya Samaj, which was initially closely associated with the Theosophists. This rather comfortable reconstruction of the past was disrupted, however, in the 1920s with the discovery of the Indus civilization, dating to the pre-Vedic 3rd millennium BC. It was primarily a sophisticated urban culture familiar with literacy. Their language has still to be deciphered from the pictograms they used. But both these features, cities and literacy, are characteristic of an urban civilization and are absent in the agro-pastoral Vedic culture. The Aryan presence was a subsequent and dissimilar culture from the Harappan. Attempts are made to project an Aryan foundation by insisting that the Harappans were also Aryan, although there is, in fact, virtually no evidence for saying so. In the 1930s, when the Hindutva version of Indian history was constructed, it was based on two major colonial theories. One was that of the Aryan origins of Indian culture and of the Hindus, and the other was the two-nation theory of antagonistic Hindu and Muslim nations, as propounded by James Mill and other colonial historians. But in the last half-century, professional historians have shown the fallacy of these two theories. Consequently, there is today a strong disagreement between the Hindutva view and that of the professionally trained historians. The latter have raised a different set of historically challenging questions, the answers to which provide more viable explanations of what might have occurred at that time. My intention here this evening is to mention some of the inquiries that professional historians and others associated with them are making in trying to reconstruct the events of the 2nd millennium BC. This points to the importance of the aspects raised by these historically more relevant questions. Let me begin by saying that the Vedic texts remain central to this study, but there are now new ways of obtaining fresh, important information from these texts. New disciplines, sources, methods have surfaced that have changed the format of the investigations. I should only mention those that are at the moment under active discussion: geography, archaeology, linguistics, and what is termed as archaeogenetics, genetics linked to archaeology. To start with geography, the Harappa culture was far more extensive than the initial Vedic culture. Harappan settlements are found from the Pamir Mountains in the north, coming south along the wider Indus Plain and across the Persian Gulf to Oman in the Arabian Peninsula. In the west, they went roughly from the Doab to Baluchistan in the east. Contacts were nurtured with the Gulf and Mesopotamia, with the Harappans, it is thought, supplying them lapis lazuli and copper. The geographical orientation, therefore, of the Harappa culture tended to be westwards and differs from the orientation of the Vedic. The Rig Veda knows the upper northwest, coming southeastwards to the Doab. The migration of Aryan speakers in the subcontinent is eastwards from the Doab into the Ganges plain. The Shatapat Brahmana has a beautiful description of Vedegha Madhava traveling east with his people and carrying Agni in his mouth. The land in the middle Ganges plain is cleared of marshes and settled. To turn now to linguistics as a source of information. In the 19th century, Vedic textual studies focused on the language of the texts and the rituals that they described. The structure of grammar was studied, as well as philology and phonetics. Vedic Sanskrit, because it was linked to the sacred, was assumed to have been isolated from other languages. In the 20th century, however, the methods of linguistics began to be applied to Vedic Sanskrit. In studying the evolution of the language, comparable forms from other languages used in the vicinity can be recognized. Speakers of other languages can be inferred from the texts. Vedic Sanskrit had evolved in the midst of other languages, and some imprint from these was evident. What were these languages? The two likely ones were Dravidian and Munda. The Dravidian presence is more evident. Among the most striking elements of Dravidian in the earliest Indo-Aryan seems to have been phonetic. Characteristic of the Dravidian language are the retroflex sounds, not found in any other Indo-European language, not even Iranian Aryan, but present in Indo-Aryan. This has suggested the interface between the two languages, and therefore between the communities that spoke these languages. There is also some vocabulary in the Vedic texts that points to some Dravidian usage. Given this, the question to be asked is whether there was the presence of other different cultures alongside the Aryas. References in Vedic texts to peoples and cultures that are said to be alien to the Arya need to be examined as differentiated cultures. There are many references to non-Aryas. The term Asura, for instance, has generally been translated as demon, but could in other contexts refer to hostile others of a different culture. And among their alien cultural habits are that they bury their dead in graves. And this was a differentiating comment from those who more frequently cremate their dead. But the most oft-repeated reference to the culturally other is, of course, the word dasa. The Arya Varna is differentiated from the Dasa Varna. The dual division means that the Dasa was not marginal, was important. The Dasas are described as Adeva because they do not worship the same gods and so are said to be without gods. They are Avrata because their rituals differ and so they are said to have no rituals, no recognizable ones. And they are Mridravacha since they speak Indo-Aryan incorrectly. Some Dasas are quite rich in cattle wealth and are therefore raided by the Aryas. There is even an occasional incorporation of a Dasa into Arya society when a situation so requires it. as, for example, when something is needed from the dasa. This is illustrated by an interesting story in the Aitareya Brahmana. It refers to a curious social category, that of what are called the Dasi Putra Brahmins, literally the Brahmanas who are the sons of Dasis. On one occasion, we are told, at the end of a ritual, the sage Kavasha was dismissed by the Brahmanas. They refused to let him eat with them, he being a Dasi Putra, the son of a Dasi. As he was going away, he prayed to the river Saraswati, and the river started following him. So the Brahmanas realized that he was somebody special and quickly invited him back, not only to join them, but also conceded his superiority. Two questions become obvious. Was there some aspect of knowledge that the Brahmanas did not have, but were willing to be taught by those who had it, even if such people were initially despised? Was the category of Brahmana a more open category than is stated in some of the later Vedic texts? Turning to archaeology as a source, there has not been any decisive evidence that can be identified as supposedly Aryan, despite the fact that it is, as I said, a language label. And despite many excavations strewn across South Punjab and Haryana and the Upper Doar, suggesting provocative questions. Various post-Harappan sites have been excavated, revealing the presence and interface of a number of cultures rather than a single culture conforming wholly to Vedic society. The origins of these appear to be diverse, and this is often so when cultures emerge from the demise of a civilization and struggle to create their own identities. Clearly, post-Harappan cultures have to be examined far more fully, both for continuities from the Harappan, which may or may not be there, and as mixed cultures that incorporate elements from the variant societies of the region and even beyond. The huge cemetery and elaborate burials these days from a site called Senauli in western UP is posing some tantalizing questions. There is a mix of some Harappan elements together with others, perhaps more local, and some from far away. And identifying the strands and placing them in context may suggest new ways of understanding this history. The most recent source likely to provide clues, and again very controversial, is the evidence from archaeogenetics, using data from archaeology. Its information comes from DNA, generally taken from skeletal material. DNA studies are of recent vintage. Samples are difficult to come by, as many a time they get contaminated owing to a long-term burial. The genetic evidence has suggested that the people of the Harappa culture may have originated from hunter-gatherers and from farmers from Iran. Sometime just after about 4,000 years before the present, that is after 2000 BC, new population strains seem to have entered North India. Some links with Central Asia are apparent. This has been read by some as evidence of migration from Central Asia into North India. And some have identified this with Aryan speakers. But more detailed evidence and definitive testing is awaited. At the same time, those who insist on the Aryans being indigenous to India, as is basic to Hindutva history, and refute any migrations, they tend to describe the genetic evidence as unreliable and therefore dismiss it. But for Hindutva, the Aryans have to be indigenous, as also indeed all Hindus. But equally vehemently, the geneticists maintain that the evidence is completely reliable. The point that I am trying to make with all this is that we have now entered an era where a person does not become a historian by reading 6 books on history, as is the popular way of becoming a historian. A historian has to be properly trained and to be so trained as to be able to work with other disciplines when required. Each piece of evidence, whether written or an object, has to be analyzed, often in more than one way. More questions are being asked these days, given the many new sources and methods of analysis that can help suggest answers. The sources have also to be tested for reliability, and the methods we use to analyze them have to be based on rational and logical thinking. This is another big divide between what is popularly posed as history and professional history. Every major historical change involves responding to an array of sources providing a range of information. Historical explanations, therefore, can no longer be single explanations. Cultures and civilizations as patterns of living and thinking evolve from the interaction of consent and dissent, manifest in a variety of facets pertaining to the participating societies. Civilizations are no longer seen as unique, self-contained, and limited to an elite. They are socially and economically porous, incorporating the migrations of peoples and ideas and the interface of more than 2 cultures. They implicitly reflect the participation and contribution of all levels of society in varied ways. And if we are truly civilized, then we should acknowledge this. Attempts are being made to legitimize the currently popular distortions of history in order to defend political ideology. This fantasized history is being projected in multiple ways through social media, TV channels, and glossy magazines, all locations where none are bothered to separate fact from fake. But also, they are propagated through more systematic ways, such as through education. The biggest fear is that the freedom to think that education ensures or should ensure will be disallowed. We have to insist that it is not authority that is at a premium, but reliable evidence and the reading of that evidence. Considerable attention has been given to the curriculum and texts for schools, and these have to be carefully examined. If we have to prevent history from being used as political propaganda, then we have to insist on the right to critique textbooks as well as the freedom to present alternate explanations where these are required. This cannot be treated as an anti-national act, as it often is by those in authority, but it is an asset in the discussion on what is being taught. The defense of history, therefore, is an imperative and imminent requirement if we are to return to being what we once were in the early years of independence. We were at that time a thoughtful, humane, secular society. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Romila, for that extraordinarily thoughtful and stimulating speech. I'm sorry that shortage of time is something which, in your case, I know was a constraint. But thank you nonetheless for having put everything within this very short span of time. With that, I would like to now move to our next speaker, who is Professor Ramya Kumar Bagchi, who is once more an outstanding economist, someone who has had a very deep and profound influence on my thinking and that of most people of my and succeeding generations. Professor Ramya Bagchi.
Prabhat, Hindu, and Sahmat for inviting me to this solemn and extremely joyous occasion. Let me also wish many, many happy returns to Professor Irfan Habib, whom I have had the good fortune to know from the year 1972. And also to Comrade Sitaram PhD. Professor Habib's scholarship does not need to be related here again. All I can say is that from the time that he brought out his first book on the agrarian system of Mughal India until 2020, when he brought out the second part of his book on national movement, we have had the good fortune of having a book in 2 to 3 years from him on all areas of Indian history, from ancient India to medieval period, to the early modern period, down to 1914, and now he has moved up to 1947. And there has been no area of history that he has not touched. He has given us the two wonderful atlases of the Mughal Empire and the Atlas of ancient Indian history. He has given us a kaleidoscope of the ways in which class struggles and caste and popular movements shaped Indian history. He has given us a view of the way in which religion has evolved in India. He has given us the ways in which medieval technology has evolved here. And we have all learned from what he has done here. This being a session on the defense of history, what I thought I would do is to defend the kind of history that I have done. I have had mainly 3 areas of research in my career. One is contemporary economic problems. The second is writing the evolution of the State Bank of India from 1806 to 1920. And the third is writing the economic history of India, primarily from the colonial period, but I have been pushed to the 11th century in recent times, following the lead of Karl Marx. I will leave out uh, the contemporary economic problems and the writing the history of the economic India, but will concentrate on colonial India. Unfortunately, colonialism still has a great influence on Indian society, particularly on a section of the Indian elite. We have had an eminent economist who is also our Prime Minister, thanking the British rule when he accepted the honorary doctorate from Oxford University. And neo-colonial thinking still pervades our economic policy making and in history writing. So I'll go back to the primarily capitalist colonialism. The question arose out of my PhD thesis, which was on the private investment during the first two plan periods. So when I have to work out the puzzle of why private investment was so sluggish in colonial India. And that led to my first book, Private Investment in India. That book challenged the usual explanations that were then being offered, and they were primarily done by British historians, Vera and Stead, and Lillian Knowles. Their explanation was that Indian economic growth during the British period was primarily hobbled because of two major factors. One was the very high rate of population growth in India, and the other was the otherworldly culture of India. What I found was that, in fact, during the whole of the 19th century, India's population growth until 1921 was far lower than that of Britain and that of certainly most other European countries and the United States. And secondly, I also found that the so-called otherworldly culture did not prevent the emergence of Indian businessmen into industrialists. The cotton textile industry in India was in fact pioneered by industrialists in Bombay and Ahmedabad, not by the British. And I also found that, in fact, contrary to some of my Marxist friends in Kolkata, who believed that Indian businessmen were short-termist and the British businessmen were not, I found that there is no evidence supporting that. In fact, the Indian businessmen during the Great Depression of the 1830s were far more forward-looking than the British businessmen. In my first book, I also dealt with the general issues of the supply side factors like labor, capital, entrepreneurship, etc. I found that Indian entrepreneurs generally were not modernists. They were primarily merchants who came up from the traditional merchant caste. But they are certainly they had much less capital than the Europeans had at their command. But even with the lower amount of capital or credit that they could command, they did not have any problem with supplying the capital that they needed. And the primary reason for the sluggishness of the investment was the lack of effective demand. I did not have at that time a clearly Marxist framework in mind, but Michael Kiplon, in reviewing my book, said that it was a Marxist book in a Keynesian camouflage. My next book was on political economy of underdevelopment, and there I dealt with not only the colonialism in India, but also in primarily in Indonesia, Latin America, and a little bit in Africa. There I propounded the view that colonial rulers used all the modes of exploitation that have been known to humankind, from slavery to serfdom to usurious merchant capital, and finally to the extraction of surplus labor from free wage earners. In the colonial countries, the last feature was the least prominent, and the other three features were the most prominent. I also found that in practically all countries, India, Indonesia, and most of Latin America that had been freed from Spanish and Portuguese rule, colonialism was complicit with landlordism. In Latin America, in Argentina and Mexico, there are ranches owned by landlords which covered scores of miles of land. And also, in most colonial and neo-colonial countries, the colonial powers depended on the landlords to discipline the farmers and peasants. In India, they created in permanent settlement and salutary areas an irresponsible zamindar class whose only duty was to give the keys in regular intervals to the treasury, and they had absolute freedom in disciplining the villagers under their sway. And when I taught economic history to my students, I always brought to their attention that in many cases novels give us a much better idea of how colonialism operated than ordinary texts of economic history. For example, in Gora, you find a respectable man being jailed because when he went to the village or gospel, he was arrested because he protested against the exactions of the illegal exactions of the zamindar. Also, I found that in colonial countries, in fact, the law and order was only for protecting the colonial power. When it came to ordinary people, it was the emergency rule that operated. What happened in Jallianwala Bagh when 300 unarmed people were mowed down by General Dyer was only the tip of the iceberg. Not only during the revolt of 1857, but also in any other cases where the British thought that the sepoys threatened resistance, they are blown off the mouth of the cannon or hung from the nearest tree. Colonialism used racializing ideologies. These racializing ideologies were primarily between the blacks and the whites, but the racializing did not stop there. Any conquered people were racialized by the colonialists. Ireland was England's oldest colony. It was conquered by England during the 12th century by Henry II. But the Irish rose again and again against the British. The latest series that I know about were in 1590s under Queen Elizabeth I, in the 1640s and the 50s under Oliver Cromwell, in the 1690s under William of Orange, and in every case there is a deliberate genocide of the Irish. And the last genocide occurred not because of any specific policy of killing the Irish, but because of the free trade policy that the British pursued in the 1850s. And Ireland never recovered its old population until the First World War. In fact, genocide has been a constant companion of capitalism. The two of the worst cases of genocide were in Southwest Africa, occupied by Germany, and in Congo, which was ruled under King Leopold of Belgium, with the management by the American explorer William Stanley. In Namibia, when the Hereros and Namas were resisting their the German oppression, there was a deliberate campaign of slaughtering them under General von Trotha. More than half of the Hereros and more than Namas of the half of the Namas were killed off either in the deliberate extermination campaign or in concentration camps. In fact, there is a direct link between the concentration camps in Namibia and the concentration camps in Hitler's Germany. Hitler had racialized Slavs who had the same complexion as the Germans had. Also, the colonial rule was justified in various ways by the rulers. One was the civilizing mission. The civilizing mission was to educate the colonized powers in the ways of the West. Sometimes that civilizing mission required genocide. As the American general who bombarded the historic city of Hue in North Vietnam, to smithereens, said that we had to destroy it in order to save it. So genocide was also that kind of policy. The people forget that the United States was built up on the series of genocides of the Native American populations. From the very beginning, when the Pilgrim Fathers landed in New England and Pennsylvania, the Native Americans realized that the British had come not to just peacefully trade with them, but to take over their land. And so they resisted. And from that time onward, the systematic genocide was carried out by the British invaders. And as the American population moved westward, more and more native Indian land was taken over and genocides occurred. The last recorded genocide that I know of was in the 1890s when the US Army mowed down an unarmed throng of 300 men, women, and children. By the time this genocide stopped, the North Indian American population the American Indian population had declined from 20 million to 300 million. The justification for this kind of genocide was provided by John Locke's theory that people had right to the land when they had mixed their labor with the soil. The English failed to recognize that the Native Americans, in fact, practiced a sustainable form of agriculture, combining the three sisters of corn, beans, and potatoes. And so they thought that these people had no right to their land. In a different way, the usurpation of Indian land was also theorized by the British on the basis of a theory of Oriental despotism. Montesquieu had advanced the theory that Asian countries had no private property. The sovereign combined both the private property and the public presence in his own person. This was contested at the same time by Aketul Dupera, who had traveled extensively in Turkey and West Asia. Also, the British officials themselves, like Mark Wills and in Mysore and Elphinstone in the Maratha territory, knew that Indians knew private property. But it was of benefit to the British to not to recognize these things, because what they wanted was land revenue, which was the main source of the unrequited surplus that they extracted from India. As I said, the British recognized the civil society only insofar as it benefited their own rule. For example, the problems that we have with the personal laws in India today originated in colonial times, because what they did was to abolish all the public laws about land ownership, but kept the private laws, the Mitaksara law and the Dayabhaga law for the Indians, and I think also for the Parsis, and the various kinds of Salafi and other laws for the Muslims. It is not true that they interfered with every aspect of Indian life. They did not interfere with those aspects of Indian life which did not conflict with the rule. Also, one of the consequences of colonial rule in India, Indonesia, Latin America, everywhere, was to make these countries almost totally agrarian. On the basis of Paul Bayrock's work, Colin Simmons had estimated that in 1750, China had 32.8% of the manufacturing capacity of the world. India had 25.6%. The third world as a whole had 73%, and today's developing countries had 27%. The result of the colonial rule was that by 1913, the share of India had declined to 1.3%. The share of China had declined to 3.6%. The share of the third world as a whole had declined to 7.5%. And the share of the developing countries had grown to 92.5%. There was some industrialization in colonial countries, but in a very unregulated way. And that unregulated way still continues. One of the best depictions of the consequences of this unregulated industrialization were made by Red Oleanders. Unfortunately, that continues in the post-independence period also. As a result of which IPCC has warned us that humanity will soon cross the limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is tolerable, and will have to deal with enormous heat waves with melting glaciers in the Himalayas, in the Andes, in the Rockies, in the Alpine peaks, and in Greenland. And there will be also oceanic, there will be rise in the ocean water, so that it is threatened that many of the Pacific islands will go under water. In Kolkata, Khidipur will go under water. Quite a few square miles of Kerala will soon go under water by 2030. Unfortunately, there is no sign that either India, China, or the United States, which are the three most polluting countries in the world, are going to adopt different issues. There is also, under British colonialism, there is an enormous deforestation in India. The East India Company, in fact, East India Railway Company, in fact, worked on wood fuels for a very long time. So that actually depleted forests all over eastern and India up to Kanpur. Moreover, these railways were constructed without paying attention to the natural challenge of rivers and streams and the gradients. So that what happened was that very often they left in their wake swamps, and those swamps bred malaria and the loss of the clean drinking water, and Indians died like flies in cholera, malaria, and other contagious diseases. The education part of the of colonial rule had in fact remained totally dormant until about I think 1820s when niggardly sum began to be allocated to that, and that niggardliness continued until 1947. Unfortunately, even today, the recommendation by Tapos Majumdar that the 6% of GDP to be spent on education in India has still to be attained, so that India has the largest mass of illiterate people in the world. The same thing goes for healthcare. The longevity of Indians in the from about 1870 to 1921 remained around 20 to 22 years, and by independence it had grown only up to about 30 or 32 years. And even after that, the refusal of the Indian government, the successive Indian government, to spend enough on healthcare and to educate people in ways of sanitary living has meant that India still has longevity which is less than 70 years. An extremely good description of the deforestation that was conducted by the British is a description of by Vibhushan Bandyopadhyay in his book Aranyak, which has been translated as by Himli Bhattacharya as of the forest. There he described not only the destruction of an extensive territory of forest in the district of Purnia, but also the way in which a caste and class-splitting society was built up in that district. I have spent most of the time on the depredations of predatory capitalism, but I should not stop there. As Rabindranath Tagore had said, that we have to take also what the West offers for us. The West did offer us a more scientific way of looking at our history, archaeology, and as Professor Rumila Thapar described lucidly, many other ways of looking at ancient texts, digging them up, reading them anew, and so on. We have to accept all of that. And we have also to accept that much of our culture has been shaped by not only the heritage of Hindustani music from North India or Carnatic music from South India, but also from the music of Western countries like that of Bach or Beethoven. Rabindranath himself was very much aware of that heritage and used many of the Western kinds of music in his various poems and in his various songs. And we have to acknowledge all of that. With that, and thanking again Professor Prof. Patnaik, Indu Chandrasekhar, and Sahamat for inviting me to this very joyous occasion, and wishing Professor Irfan Habib and Professor Sitaram Yeturi many happy returns. I will end my talk.
Thank you very much, Om Yoda, for that very wide-ranging and deep lecture. Our next speaker is Professor Aditya Mukherjee, who was a professor of history at the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, just retired. Aditya, I would now request Aditya to make his speech.
Thank you, Prabhat. It is a matter of great honor to be associated with an event felicitating Professor Irfan Habib, one of the tallest intellectuals India has produced since independence. Professor Habib has the rare distinction of a scholar from the third world who has played a stellar role in making a school of history, the Aligarh School, which is recognized globally as, and no one can write certainly about medieval period in India without reference to this school. He has in recent years made very important contributions to the understanding of other periods of history from the ancient to the contemporary. At 90, he shows no signs of the nervous 90s and is moving towards hitting the century with his firm, resolute, and fearless voice. By honoring him, we elevate ourselves. That the discipline of history, the master discipline, as E.P. Thompson in his celebrated essay, The Poverty of Theory, put it, is a discipline in which, I'm quoting him, all other human disciplines meet. The queen of humanities. That such a discipline has to be defended is a paradox. The discipline of history studies the social process in its totality. It cannot assume away anything as constant, as many economists famously tend to do. Economy, polity, social structure, culture, climate, psychology, everything has to be taken into account. Hence, history encompasses other disciplines, be it economics, politics, sociology, anthropology, psychology, climate science, as Romila showed, linguistics, genetic sciences, and whatnot. Thinkers in other disciplines, whether they be philosophers or economists or sociologists or even major political leaders, whenever they make a breakthrough, they often end up writing history or being deeply informed by it. If I may give some examples, Karl Marx, Morris Dobb, Samir Amin, Immanuel Wallerstein, Lenin, Jawaharlal Nehru, all are examples of what I just stated. Why then do we have to defend the discipline of history, the title of the symposium today? The discipline of history must remain, is and must remain open to ideological influences and multiple interpretations. It is an ideographic rather than nomothetic discipline, a distinction highlighted by the Gulbenkian Commission report on the restructuring of social sciences in the late 1990s. Again, E.P. Thompson puts it very nicely. He says, history, the most unitary and general of all human disciplines, must always be least precise. Her knowledge will never be, in however 1,000 years, anything more than proximate. Though it is knowledge, as has been emphasized again by Professor Thapar, attained through its own rigorous procedures of historical logic, its own discourse of proof, which we normally call the scientific method. Given this tentative, proximate nature of the discipline, history has been put to the service of diverse social forces. On the one hand, interpretations of history have been used by ruling regimes to legitimize their rule, as it has been used by social movements, both progressive as well as reactionary social movements, to defend positions that they have taken. On the other hand, doing complete violence to the majesty of the discipline of history, to its procedures and to the discourse of proof, total falsification, invention of facts, substituting facts with faith, beliefs, mythology, and what have you, has been resorted to. It is both these aspects that I shall now turn to, limiting the discussion to the Indian contexts. When the various disciplines of the human and social sciences, such as history, economics, psychology, social anthropology, etc., evolved in the 19th and early 20th centuries, much of the present developing world was under colonial rule. These disciplines, therefore, carried at their birth, to use a phrase from psychology, the imprint of the Eurocentric colonial worldview, and it would remain unless it was struggled against. With most colonies having now acquired political independence, many former colonies have achieved substantial economic progress, edging their way towards the economic high table. However, space in the intellectual high table is still to come. It is an aspect of continued domination of the Eurocentric colonial worldview that schools of thought appear to emerge only from the West. The Cambridge School in history, the Chicago School in economics, even the Subaltern School emerges largely from the West, although it is aided by third world intellectuals who have migrated to the West or aspire to do so. There is a virtual absence of any school emerging from the countries of the South, several of which have had more than 5,000 years of civilization interrupted only by the colonial interregnum. It is in this context that Irfan Habib's contribution is to be evaluated in challenging existing perspectives and charting out an alternative path. In fact, many of the galaxy of speakers here, such as Professor Thapar and Romeo Bagchi and Prabhat Patnaik, are sterling examples of people who have challenged the dominant discourse that we are faced with. The colonial interpretation of Indian history underwent substantial changes over time. At the point of initial contact, when, as Professor Bagchi said, India produced about 8 times the share of global GDP than Britain. At that time, at the point of initial contact, the first stage or the merchant capital stage, the British chroniclers, the Orientalists, etc., had a very high opinion of Indian civilization. And many even thought that it was superior to British civilization. The attitude was of learning. The trader did not need to change Indian society. Now, this kind of perception changes very rapidly by the early 19th century, when Britain emerges as the first industrialized nation in the world, and the second or the industrial capital stage comes. At that time, there is the need to transform the Indian economy and make it a subservient adjunct to the industrializing Britain. This is the time that the utilitarian, the Whig, the liberal imperialist school of thought emerges. All that we now are familiar with, the notion of the barbaric nature of the Indians or the colonial people, the savage conditions, the child people, the notion of the white man's burden, who have to now civilize, modernize, develop these people comes up. And even the notion that they now have to educate these people towards self-government gradually, of course, and provided, of course, they are civilized and educated enough, as Macaulay put it, to allow free trade. This was also the period when the completely communal and erroneous notion of Hindu rule and Muslim rule was brought in, and the notion how British, not Christian, rule was delivering India from the tyranny of Muslim rule in the medieval period. This perspective dominated till about the 19th century, till about the late 19th century. In the late 19th century, when the third stage of colonialism, the finance capital stage, and the deepening and spreading of industrialization process to many other countries other than Britain emerges, there is a fierce scramble for the colonies, for acquiring new colonies, and for establishing a firm control over the existing ones. This was necessary not only because the markets and the sources of raw material had to be protected, but because the investments now that were being made in the colonies had to be protected. As Lenin had put it in just one line, he said, "The creditor is more firmly attached to the debtor than the seller is to the buyer." The ideology of training the colonial people for self-governance was now replaced with colonial people being permanently unfit for self-rule. The talk of leaving was now abandoned. For example, Sir Richard Temple, the governor of Bombay, wrote in 1880, "England must keep India because a vast amount of British capital has been sunk in the country, on the assurance of British rule being, humanly speaking, perpetual." So this notion of British rule being perpetual has now come in. Now, how do you legitimize this notion of a permanent colonial rule? A new ideology now emerges. Increasingly, the key notion that colonial rule was necessary moves away from the notion that it is necessary for development, for modernization, etc. Those theories had been blown to the skies largely by our early nationalists. Now the key idea that legitimates colonial rule is the notion that the colonial rule is necessary to keep peace among a people deeply divided on the basis of religion and caste. Self-government based on democratic elective principles as demanded by the Indian national movement could not be granted, as then the religious majority, the Hindus, would suppress and oppress the religious minority, the Muslims and others. Since this legitimation for continuance of colonial rule was based on the notion of a divided people, the colonial state now made every conceivable effort to create, consolidate, and provoke this divide. Indian history was now seen as one where the Indian people were always divided on the basis of primordial identities of religion and caste. Unlike other Western societies, Indian people could only mobilize themselves around these identities. They could not be mobilized on the basis of class or nation and other identities. The religious communal ideology and a communal interpretation of history was thus born and propagated assiduously. As India has learned to its grave cost, the longest lasting legacy of colonialism has not been the economic or political devastation that it brought about. It has globally been, beginning with Ireland, the first colony, it has been that it has left behind a divided people. Wherever colonialism has gone, it has left behind a divided people. The first resistance to a colonial communal, I put them together because the umbilical cord between the two can never be overemphasized, that these two notions emerged together, one causing the other. The resistance to colonial and communal interpretation of Indian history firstly came from the Indian intelligentsia, which was closely linked with the national liberation struggle. This is an important point, that it was people, the intelligentsia, which was linked to a movement that first brought out the critique. It has important implications for today. Through intense intellectual effort, the early nationalists destroyed the imperialist ideological hegemony based on the notion of colonialism leading to development. Subsequently, other ideologues of the national movement, people like Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhash Bose, Bhagat Singh, Maulana Azad, critiqued other aspects of the colonial worldview, including the communal interpretation of history. These challenges to the colonial perspective, communal perspective, however, remained largely in the political domain and did not succeed in substantially altering the academic disciplinary order, as the academic sphere was largely controlled by the colonial state. There were, of course, exceptions, people who paid a heavy price for taking positions in the academic field as well. The break in the academic sphere in the discipline of history comes after independence. A large output of a very high level of scholarship in premier universities of the country began to emerge in the 1960s and 70s, seriously questioning Eurocentric colonial communal perspectives. It is from that period that the galaxy present here, people like Romila Thapar, Prabhat Patnaik, Irfan Habib, Omyo Bagchi, along with people like R.S. Sharma, Satish Chandra, Bipin Chandra, M.N. Srinivas, Yogendra Singh, Amartya Sen, Randhir Singh. I mean, there's a huge list that they all begin. There is an explosion of material that emerges in various disciplines in this period, which questions the existing colonial paradigm. JNU too was started in this period in 1969 with a clear mandate to promote an independent, non-colonial, secular, and pro-poor perspective. The 1960s also saw an effort made through the NCERT to bring the results of this new scholarship that I just spoke of to school children. Many of the stalwarts that I just now mentioned wrote books, textbooks for school children. Professor Thapar wrote a book for class 6 children, for example. This was an experiment I do not think which was replicated anywhere in the world. Outstanding texts were produced for children, which have survived till today, more than 50 years later, even though the NCERT, the government has removed it from their list. Those books still survive. The struggle for the survival of a scientific, secular, and non-colonial history began virtually at the time that it was being written, because it came almost immediately under attack from neo-colonial and communal forces. The colonial attack came from the Cambridge School, from the 1960s itself, which made a mockery of our national liberation struggle and all the values that that struggle stood for. In economic history, again from the 1960s, in Maurice de Morris in the 1960s, Cambridge Economic History in the 1980s, they have been critiqued by both Professor Bagchi and by Professor Habib very strongly. And a cruder version of both Morris and Cambridge School was Tirthankar Roy and Meghnad Desai, who produced a very strong defense of the colonial paradigm. The last two, Desai and Roy, also attacked the Nehruvian consensus in which the left was very much a part in trying to build an independent, self-reliant, complex economy after independence. For these people today, the neo-colonial people, the colonial period and the period following the neoliberal turn in the recent years, these were the good periods. The Nehru period were, as they call it in their language, the wasted years. The pro-colonial Nehru bashing was supported at a much more crass level by the communal Nehru bashing. A bonding of the neo-colonial, neoliberal, and communal fascist forces, which has acquired such dangerous proportions today. The neglect of the social sciences, particularly history in post-colonial countries, and the focus on science and technology, an area which was left barren purposely by the colonial powers, was understandable because that was the need of the day. But it had some important unintended implications. It left the field open to influences emerging from the first world uncritically in the social sciences. It also left the field open to political tendencies misusing the discipline of history. There are top institutions in the country today, some of the most elite schools, which do not even offer the option of history to the students. It's not necessary, it's just given up. Is it a surprise then that the products of such institutions with degrees in management and engineering move heaven and earth to migrate to the West, and having done so, begin to tow a colonial perspective about their own society, and in large numbers fund obscurantist reactionary communal forces? The communal attack on scientific history was sustained from the beginning by the RSS. Soon after the ban on the RSS was lifted and 25,000 of them who were arrested by Patel were released on condition that they will not indulge in politics, the RSS said that they were now a cultural organization. And they now focused totally to a very large extent on school education, on education. The first Saraswati Sishu Mandir was created in 1952 with M.S. Golwalkar inaugurating it. And within years, by 1977, there were 500 RSS schools. By 1993, there were 6,000. By 1999, there were 14,000. They've multiplied like anything. These texts teach tender minds, 9, 10-year-old school children. For example, about Islam, they teach. They come with a sword in one hand and the Quran in the other. Wherever they go, houses of prayers and universities were destroyed. Libraries were burnt. Religious books were destroyed. Mothers and sisters were humiliated. Mercy and justice were unknown to them. Never mind who demolished the Babri Masjid, who vandalized the Bhandarkar Library in Pune, who humiliated mothers and sisters in Gujarat. But this is what they're taught. About Christians, it is said, it is because of the conspiratorial policies of the followers of this religion that India was partitioned. Even today, Christian missionaries are engaged in fostering anti-national tendencies in Nagaland, Meghalaya, Arunachal, Bihar, Kerala, and other regions of our country, because of which there is a grave danger to the integrity of present-day India. These books eulogize Hitler. They tell you about how the Kaaba was actually a shivling. They, like their colonial masters, in all their writings, they undermine, and this is again a big congruence, they undermine the Indian national movement. They distort it, and wherever they can, they completely ignore it. There are textbooks brought out in some BJP ruled states where textbook on the national movement doesn't even have the name of Nehru. Or they forget to, for example, even mention in a contemporary history book that Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated, leave alone say who and why this happened. As the communal forces, but the spread of communal and factually wrong historical understanding was not limited to the RSS schools. This is important. As the communal forces began to get close to state power, they, in a textbook manner, followed their colonial masters in trying to communalize society, including by launching an attack on secular scientific history. The first time they came close to state power was in 77, 79. The RSS, the Jansangh and the RSS having merged into the Janata Party, and immediately they started an assault. They said that the books, the NCERT books written by the scholars that I mentioned, Pramila Thapar, Satish Chandra, Bipin Chandra, etc., that they should be banned. But at that time, the institutions in India still functioned. Beginning with the NCERT itself, the media and universities all over the country protested on a very large scale. The books therefore survived. Next time the NDA came to power, that is in 2004, they learned the lessons of the previous time. They first changed the institutional heads of the CBSE, of the UGC, of NCERT, and all the institutions. They changed their heads, put pliable people, and then on dictation by the RSS, tried to delete about 42 passages from the books written by these scholars, Pramila Thapar, R.S. Sharma, etc. When there was a protest, and there was a widespread protest, beginning with the Indian History Congress, people like Amartya Sen, people like the former president K.R. Narayanan, large number of editors protested. When they protested, they were described as anti-national. The RSS chief called them anti-Hindu Euro-Indians. The alarming tendency of intimidating those who do not agree with the Hindutva version of history was seen in a group of people collecting at the house of the Education Minister Murli Manohar Joshi and demanding the arrest of historians like Romila Thapar, R.S. Sharma, and Arjun Dev. The minister, on his part, added fuel to this fascist tendency and said that these scholars, the history written by these scholars, is intellectual terrorism, which is more dangerous than the cross-border terrorism that is occurring in the country, and therefore needs to be countered effectively. He was egging them on. The decade beginning 2004 when the Hindu communal forces were ousted from state power at the center, provided some reprieve from the communal onslaught. The opportunity the secular forces unfortunately failed to utilize to challenge on a war footing the rapid communalization of society done through the spread of a virulent communal interpretation of history. Even though during the election, the promises was made that there will be detoxing of history, that there will be Talibanizing of history, but once in power, these were all forgotten. Since 2014, now that the BJP is there without any restraining influence of any coalition partners, the same game has started all over again in an identical manner. A report emerges written, guided by Mr. Sumit Bhasin, who's the national convener of the e-training cell of BJP. He's not a historian. A report is made by him, and the questions raised in that report are to be investigated by a committee of the Rajya Sabha headed by an major RSS ideologue. An article appears in Organizer, and lo and behold, immediately comes the UGC with a syllabus, which Professor Habib has very recently described as one which pushed the communal ideological offensive favored by the ruling regime. He says, Professor Habib has written that it is not only intended to present a false, patently communalized caricature of Indian history, but is qualitatively also patently incompetent, unacademic exercise. The ideological offensive has now gone way beyond a distorted interpretation of history in the academic sphere. It is now aimed at creating in the public mind, through relentless propaganda, a totally false notion of pride in a mythic past with which only the majority community is identified. A great mythic past of the majority community. This pride is combined simultaneously with the promotion of the notion of victimhood and fear of this among the same majority community, which is shown to be threatened now by the minority community. This is the classic recipe used by fascist regimes globally, as has been shown recently brilliantly by a philosopher from Yale, Jason Stanley, in his book, How Fascism Works. Not historians, but people holding the highest office with degrees in fictitious subjects like entire political science, even which get lost, they now tell you that what kind of science we had in ancient India, that Ganesha could have his elephant snout only through plastic surgery. The governor of Bengal, trained in physics, does violence both to physics and to history to say that Arjuna of the epic Mahabharata actually used nuclear-tipped arrows. One could multiply dozens of examples like this. But despite such great achievements, the Hindus today are said to be under grave threat. This is this combination. Great achievement in the past, but currently under threat. They are regularly reminded of what atrocities Muslims allegedly committed in the past. There is a popular folklore in just neighborhood Haryana, where it is said among the people that Aurangzeb could not sleep every night until he could see a huge mound of sacred thread worn by the upper caste Hindus was shown to him, and he could see it from his window. He could not sleep. The BJP, of course, dutifully showed its great valor in removing Aurangzeb's name from a road in Delhi. The Home Minister, with a BSc degree in biochemistry, some say actually only 12th pass, warns you of Muslim infiltrators, the Ghuspetiyas, who like termites have spread out all over. The terms are all his, not mine. They, like termites, have spread out all over the country, threatening the integrity of the country. The fear of a pan-Islamic threat is being stoked. That is, Muslims of the world will join hands against the Hindus, rendering the preponderant majority of the Hindus useless. On top of all this, totally contrary to every study on the subject, including a very brilliant study by S.Y. Qureshi, the former election commissioner. It is said that the Muslims in India, through a deliberate strategy, are rapidly increasing their numbers and shall soon catch up with the majority. You've all heard 5 se 25, 4 se 40 kind of language used by very eminent leaders of the BJP. To combat this, a law is now being proposed in UP to punish the UP Population Control Bill, to punish those with large families. Using another common practice of fascist regimes, that of stoking sexual anxiety. Fear is now being created among the majority community that their unsuspecting innocent women are being lured away by Muslims in order to convert them, and much worse. The so-called love jihad, to protect against which the BJP states have actually enacted stringent laws. And all the laws, like the anti-sedition law or the UAPA, are implemented in a manner that the minority community always appears to be the chief culprits. It no longer looks like the country our freedom fighters fought for and created. The values of the national movement enshrined in our constitutions are being violated wantonly. The distortion of history and the rapid manufacturing of untruths in the name of history for purposes totally destructive of the survival of India as a constitutional democracy are occurring today. But unfortunately, the resistance to these efforts appear to have got progressively more and more muted. Perhaps it is a reflection of the gradual erosion of the institutions which were supposed to be independent. The judiciary, the police, the media, bodies controlling the education system are increasingly standing by, if not actually collaborating in the process of the withering away of our democracy. The universities have been silenced. A culture of fear and opportunism pervades. A large part of our political opposition, unfortunately, for fear of losing the vote of the already communalized majority, treads softly in protesting against the fundamental rights guaranteed by our constitution being brazenly snatched away from the minorities, including the right to citizenship, right not to be lynched, not to be killed in police custody, are being taken away. Gone are the days of Gandhi and Nehru, who staked their life to protect the minorities in India. Yet, all is not lost. Our youth all over the country demonstrated their capacity to resist during the countrywide agitation against the CAA, which clearly targeted the citizenship of the minorities. Significantly, the protesting youth were using the Constitution as their Bible and portraits of Gandhi, Bhagat Singh, Nehru, and Ambedkar. Our peasants are again demonstrating, as they did during the national liberation struggle, their capacity to resist for months, despite untold suffering being inflicted on them and efforts to give a communal color to their protests. On history, we have seen the Indian History Congress, the Paschim Bongo Itihas Samshad, Punjab History Front in Bhatinda. Some newspapers like the Telegraph have started protesting against the kind of changes that are being sought to be brought about in history textbooks all over again. We have people like Professor Irfan Habib, who despite his age is still fearlessly leading from the front in resisting the misuse of history by colonial and communal forces. Professor Habib, as many of you probably know, has staked his life on many occasions, with his colleagues having to put a protective ring around him in defense of the national flag and against fierce attacks by both Muslim and Hindu communalists. In honoring Professor Habib, we take a step in the direction of defending history. Thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, Aditya. if Professor Shireen Musfi is here, then this is the time that I would like her to speak her words of felicitation before I call upon Professor Irfan Habib to respond to the speeches made today. Is Professor Shireen Musfi here?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. Please.
Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to be able to say a few words about my supervisor and teacher from whom I have learned all my history. I would like to begin saying that Professor Irfan Habib is not only well known for his very deep research in Mughal economy and other subjects, but we should also remember that he has done a human service by bringing out a series of the People's History of India, which covers right from prehistory and industrialization down to national movement and also the man and environment, in which most of the books are authored by him. Some are jointly, but largely all are. He's not only confined, and these books are most useful for those who are coming to history from outside the realm of history, those who are appearing in IAs, those who are trying to learn history by them. Then he wrote another textbook, which is not a very easy job, on medieval India on the insistence of Professor Titin Chandra, which the NBT published when he was director. Titin asked him to write that. That book is also shows that how one can make one's very high level of scholarship understandable for all. Another thing on which I would like to say a few words is his method of writing himself and editing the work of others, of which I have a first-hand experience by having the privilege of being the co-editor of our society's journal, Aligarh Student Society's journal, Studies in People's History. I see how Irfan Saab not only edit the papers, but improve them, particularly coming from the younger scholars, to a level which is almost impossible for anyone else to understand if he has not gone through. And then how he keeps on correcting, telling them how to improve them, writing them, what other sources they should include, how they should do it, and then correcting the language. He's stickler as far as language is concerned, to such an extent that he keeps on correcting his own, not only the views, but also changing or modifying, but also his language correcting that. So he edits his own work as well. So recently, he has written a paper on Akbar's policy of Sulh-e-Kul. As a co-editor, I'm mainly doing only with the correspondence with our publisher, and therefore I got an order. I'm withdrawing my paper and I want to change it altogether. Immediately write to them to do that. And then I received a brand new paper with much more information on Sulh-e-Kul, which he collected from so many other sources, painstakingly, and then said that you have to persuade them to replace my paper with a present one. So it's something which one can, or at least I think I have learned from him, that nothing is perfect. And perfection is something which one should always aim at. It is not sufficient to write and to feel satisfied with it, but you have to keep improving your own standards, even if you have reached the standards. I think I won't take longer because Sita has also perhaps to join.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you, Shireen. It's with great pleasure now that I would call upon Professor Irfan Habib to respond to the comments and the speeches made by the various speakers. Professor Habib.
How much time do I have?
As long as you like, but approximately 20 minutes.
All right. Thank you so much. I should first like to thank all the previous speakers. Comrade Yuchuri, Professor Romila Thapar, Professor Bhattachy, Professor Aditya Mukherjee, for their kind words, and also, of course, for the contents of their addresses. Already much has been said about the importance of objectivity in Indian history and the need for defense against the communal offensive which we are seeing today, in order to present a colored version of history which would justify their present so-called majoritarian policies, which are not actually majoritarian, because these policies go against the peasants, they go against the workers, they against the poor people throughout the country. But supposedly, on behalf of the majority, they paint the Muslims as the particular destructive element in Indian history. And they also, of course, gloss over the history of Dalits. The only thing they would do is to praise Ambedkar for his role in the drafting of the text of the Constitution of India. I think it is very important for every country to have, as far as possible, an accurate idea of a person's memory. If a person feels that he has always been at the top, that he has always been misunderstood, that he is always great, he could have done so much, but others prevented him, or he had actually done so. Now, that person would be doing an injustice to himself. A false memory is almost a disease. And I think one should understand that a false history for a country is just like a false memory for an individual. It is a disease for the country. And there are always examples before us. Japan having a totally false history of either victimhood or supremacy. All other countries, all other peoples around were just barbarians. We were superior, but they suppressed us. They harmed us. The Jews undermined the German might, and so on and so forth, which of course the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha in its later phases, they brought that picture to India. As one can see in Golwalkar's We Are Nation Defined, and in Savarkar's writings. And these, of course, have been followed by what had been taught in RSS schools, and then now is, of course, the official doctrine in the country. I followed in detail the Professor Romila Thapar's illustration of this by the way Aryan problem has been treated, so-called Aryan question has been treated. It almost seems always that the RSS views or the Indian government's views of the Aryans now, of the UGC's view of the Aryans, is like the German views. Actually, the word colonized by Germans. Germany was the original Aryan race, original land of the Aryan race. And RSS says as if it is something great to be an Aryan. Why? Why not a Dravidian? Why not? Why should it not be great to be a Dravidian and a Burmese, the Southeast Asian? What is so special in being an Aryan? It's just the Nazi idea transported to India. And similarly, the notion that by praising yourself, you are building the nation. Actually, these two things are totally unconnected. A nation is built by one's hard work, by developing research and technology, by developing democracy, civil liberty, and so on. It is not actually built by self-praise. So what the RSS and BJP ideologues are now doing, so-called ideologues, are actually harming this country almost beyond repair if they are not prevented. And therefore, not only historians, but all people who are truly patriotic must stand up against what the BJP is doing. What is important is that just as when you want to go back to your experiences, if you are a normal being, you would like to have a correct memory of what happened. So also a country should have a correct memory of what happens. We had great historians. Personally, I remember that when I, passing high school, I took history among my subjects in intermediate. I came across at the railway station a book which I bought out of my pocket money. At that time, it was cheap enough. R.G. Bhandarkar's A Peep into the Early History of India. I think it is still a brilliant work with regard to historical method. How do you find a historical fact? How do you develop it? How do you make use of inscriptions? In a small book, it told us all about historical method. And R.G. Bhandarkar, nowadays, although he was proud of being a Brahmin, never makes a statement which you can object to. Everything is precise, based on the sources. So India has a historical tradition of which one can be proud, one should be proud when one thinks of people like R.G. Bhandarkar and others who have, and of course in our own time, Professor Rumala Thapar, and Professor, who I consider as Dean of the Indian historians today. So we can be proud of our profession. But the essential thing is that the message should be spread and there should be a more effective opposition to the kind of distortion of history that is now being projected. And of course, it's not only history, but other branches of humanities would be affected. And I don't see how, with this attitude in mind, science would not be affected. So you might call what you might give, go on giving certificates to what is called the national education policy as against the new educational policy. But first of all, as far as I have read, there is nothing brilliant about it, and many problems are just overlooked. But merely talking about a national education policy doesn't give you a real scientific rational education. And of course, developing a proper historical method and defending proper history is a part of our educational effort, must become a part of our educational effort as against the kind of effort that the BJP government is promoting. I again thank, I perhaps forgot to mention in the beginning the name of Professor Shirin Musvi, who had also very kind words for me. But I must warn everyone that I'm 90 and probably will become soon an old cankerous man. I'm very old already, but of course my future is not very certain. So I can only thank you for your kind words, and I hope that the effort that you have made in organizing this function would persuade a large number of our colleagues, young people, not only to take to history, but to defend the historical method and improve the present accurate presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Habib. The organizers were very keen that at the end I should say a few words. I know it's very late. My own inclination would be not to do so. But on the other hand, I don't want to, as it were, commit a dereliction of duty. Before I begin, I just want to say that many of the papers which were presented here would be published in a special number of social scientists, which we hope to bring out soon. And those who may have missed out on some of the lectures would be able to access them in the social scientists. The other thing is that many have actually produced artworks on this occasion, and those artworks also we shall try and carry in social sciences. Throughout this evening, we have talked about defending history against the attacks by the communal forces, which of course are now extremely serious. But in addition, I just want to draw your attention to something which is an extremely serious challenge, perhaps less to history than it is to my own discipline, which is economics. And that is what I would call the tyranny of the profession. That within any profession, there is usually a certain discourse which is seen to be acceptable. There is another discourse which is seen to be something which is completely unacceptable. Now, if you stray into the latter discourse, in that case, you run the risk of not getting published, not getting an appointment as an academic, not getting promotions, and all the rest of it. Now, I think, therefore, the profession, in fact, has a tyranny, particularly in economics, which is dominated by the metropolis. I'll give you a personal anecdote to make this point. Once I was in South Africa, and a friend of mine, who's a professor of economics in the University of Wits in Johannesburg, asked me to go and speak in the university, in his department, on the neoliberal reforms that India had just introduced. This was the early 90s. So I was very critical of the neoliberal reforms in my speech. At the end of which he told me, Prabhat, you shouldn't have said what you did the way you did. Rather, what you should have said is that the sequencing of reforms is wrong, because then people would begin to listen to you and take you seriously. If you reject the neoliberal reform, then people would not. Why not? Because it is not a part of the acceptable discourse. Now, I think a very important, issue in defending a discipline is to fight for a discourse which is completely supposed to be unacceptable by the profession, which, as it were, is at the head of the discipline, or which defines the discipline. I think in India, many, as Aditya said, many institutions, including JNU, were actually doing this. But all those institutions are being now sought to be destroyed, because of which I think the tyranny of the profession is going to be complete. And this tyranny of the profession is one which obviously would mean the tyranny of the metropolis, of metropolitan thinking. As I said, this is probably less important in history, which is more polycentric than economics. But on the other hand, this is something which certainly is visible in economic history. I'll give you a few illustrations. For instance, you find that between 1700 and almost the end of the Napoleonic Wars, stretching over a period that lasts longer than a century, there was heavy protection in Britain against the import of Indian cotton cloth. For the first 75 years, this protection was so serious that actually anyone either wearing such cloths or even in possession of such cloths could be fined an amount which was pretty high by the per capita income of Britain in that period. So it's a fairly heavy punishment which was meted out to anyone who actually used Indian cloths. That's at the demand of the British woolen industry. Now, this is something which actually allowed a British cotton textile industry to come up initially to, a cotton linen mix called fustian, but subsequently cotton textile industry itself. Now, you find that any number of books on the Industrial Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, as Eric Hobsbawm says, anyone who talks Industrial Revolution talks cotton. The Industrial Revolution was in cotton. But on the other hand, there is among very few, in fact, no modern British historian of the Industrial Revolution do you find even a mention of this fact. You find it in Paul Mantoux, you find it in Frederick List, but not certainly in David Landis, who wrote the book Unbound Prometheus, nor even is the tyranny of the profession so great, even in the writings of someone like Eric Hobsbawm, very distinguished Marxist historian. I'll give you a second example. There is this whole story of there being an agricultural revolution preceding the industrial revolution. You look at any number of textbooks on British economic history, any number of textbooks on the Industrial Revolution. When I was an undergraduate or an MA student, I used to read these textbooks. There would always be a chapter on the Agricultural Revolution preceding the chapter on the Industrial Revolution. But when you look at the Agricultural Revolution, during the entire period from 1700 to 1850, over 150 years, the per capita food grain output in Britain actually fell, declined in absolute terms. And that is what gave rise to the demand for the repeal of the Corn Laws and so on. And of course, this is something which also, made the British dependent on the colonies for the import of a whole lot of raw materials, which they got gratis because of the trade. Now, there is no mention of this. On the other hand, the idea of the agricultural revolution is actually used to poo-poo any reliance that can be attributed for British economic history, historical experience on the colonies. Now, that's another example of the tyranny of the profession. You don't find anyone actually talking against the agricultural revolution, even though the statistics about the decline in per capita food production in Britain is well known. But nobody talks about it because it is outside the acceptable discourse. Likewise, for instance, the drain. Everybody knows that the drain on which we have so much to say from India is something that doesn't figure at all in any British economic history discussions. And my point is, once the struggle for setting up institutions for propagating an alternative discourse is given up, then actually we would also begin to accept the same discourse. And in India, people will begin to also imbibe the views that British economic historians have about the drain, which is basically that it is one of those, the figment of the nationalist imagination. And we all know that these days nationalism is a dirty word. It's taken to be synonymous with fascism and so on. Therefore, nationalism is bad. And this is what the Indian nationalist writers said, and therefore they don't have to be taken seriously. But the role of the drain, for instance, in making raw materials and food grains available to Britain and making them available gratis is something which is just not discussed. Now, I'm not saying that all these ideas should be just accepted. Not at all. I mean, let there be huge debate on trade. Let there be huge debate on the agricultural revolution. Let there be huge debate on protectionism in Britain and its role and so on. But the point is that there has to be a debate. In order to have a debate, you must have a discourse within which these things figure. But if they don't figure at all, then of course there's no debate. And therefore, this is the tyranny that I'm talking about, that actually a certain position is propagated not on the basis of the strength of evidence, not on the basis of debate, but on the basis of the kind of power that is wielded by some in the profession, some who define what is the discourse in the profession. I'll give you another example, the gold standard. Now, there was a British economic historian, S.B. Saul, who actually looked at how the gold standard was sustained and then came to the conclusion that really the current account of the colonies were manipulated in such a way, he called them colonies were markets of tap. Like a tap, you can open it. So how the markets of the colonies or the colonial economies were markets on tap through which the gold standard was sustained. The kind of investment made by Britain in the New World and Britain's own balance of payments current account deficit vis-a-vis these countries of the New World could be paid for by manufacturing a current account surplus vis-a-vis the colonies, and how this was done. Since Paul's study, no other study has actually looked at this question at all, and it has dropped out of the discourse because you find, for instance, now lots of people writing, for instance, about the return to the gold standard in 1925, or writing about the gold standard, who really completely detach this aspect of colonialism from the gold standard. The fact that the gold standard is one that actually rested on colonialism is something which is completely sought to be obliterated. And I suspect, as I said, that with institutions like the ANU and so on disappearing, you actually would find that this would also become standard practice when it comes to Indian students, and they would imbibe exactly the same kinds of ideas. Now, I say all this because I think that the whole effort is to project a picture of capitalist development, a picture of capitalism which is totally dissociated from the colonial prop of capitalist development. That colonialism played no role whatsoever as far as the economy is concerned. Now, this is something which is very common in economics, where the most kind of standard growth model is one which actually looks at the capitalist economy within, confined to itself in isolation, where you have capitalists and workers and, of course, the state ensuring the rules of the game, in which basically capital accumulates, labor grows naturally, and thereby the growth takes place. But on the other hand, this is completely, I mean, there's no role for colonialism or the outside world in this, and this is something which is standard practice in economics. But this standard practice in economics also spills over into economic history, where you find that any recognition of the role of the colonies and so on is something which is completely done away with. And associated with this is a look at international trade as essentially a voluntary coming together at the international level between nations for undertaking exchange, which is beneficial to each of them. that international trade is beneficial to all participant nations. There's no question of forced commercialization, no question of trade at gunpoint and so on, which we know from history were actually common practices. So this is a kind of danger to the integrity of a discipline, which of course should not be lost sight of. And as Aditya was pointing out, that this kind of a danger is underscored, is further supplemented by the kind of communal attack on whatever centers had been built up, centers of excellence, Aligarh University or JNU and so on, where there was some effort at building up an alternative discourse. So you have here again, in a very different way from what Aditya was saying, in a very different way, you actually have a communal imperial nexus. And this nexus is one which is going to really destroy independence of thought, destroy scientific history, scientific economic history, and of course, scientific economics. And I just thought that I'll take these few minutes to bring this to your notice. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. I would now ask Indira Chandrasekhar to move a formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, Prabhat. In conclusion, on behalf of Sehmat, social scientist, and Tulika Books again, I would like to say a big, big thank you to Professors Irfan Habib, Romila Thapar, Omyo Bagchi, Prabhat Patnaik, Aditya Mukherjee, and to Sitaram Yechuri and Professor Shireen Musfi. Thank you very much. Rajan Prasad is an organizer of this event, and so propriety dictates that he not be thanked. But I would like to acknowledge here his crucial role, as always, in conceptualizing and implementing it. Thanks are due to Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar for advice and support, to Professor Vikas Raval for technical help and guidance in both setting up and publicizing this event, to Ram Rahman for designing the e-invitation, and to other friends, colleagues, and comrades. They know who they are, for all manner of help. Last but not least, all of you who have stayed till 9 p.m. for the last 2.5 hours with us, thank you for joining us today. Thank you.